Learning foreign languages is an individualistic effort, not a collective one. Contrary to what is being told to people in schools, you can't really learn a foreign language in a classroom, at least not efficiently. I speak 7 languages fluently, another 4 quite decently, and I can understand 16 languages. That's my claim to authority on this topic. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is a video resulted from dozens and dozens of comments asking me how many languages do I speak, how can other people try to achieve something in this department, and so on and so forth. Well, what I'm about to say is brutally unpopular, because while it is true, it is not the message being pushed by learning institutions or even by most of the polyglots out there who are busy popularizing how desirable it is to be a polyglot. As usual, I will remind everyone that what I'm about to say is not the absolute truth, but just the true things I have discovered and tested throughout my lifetime, both on myself and other people who have looked up to me as a teacher. So with that said, here are 5 things to keep in mind on the topic of learning foreign languages. Number 1. Speaking a language and understanding a language are 2 different skills. The English language doesn't even have the proper tools to explain this, not in a way that conveys the message, that is. In the Russian language, for instance, the difference between I know Russian, I speak Russian, and I understand Russian is very clear to native speakers and advanced second or third language speakers. In English, on the other hand, there is only I speak English, or French, or Swedish, or whatever, with the implication that speaking a language means you also understand it, or that you understanding it means that you also speak it. That's just not true, though. For instance, when I read the Dutch press, or the Flanders press in Belgium, I understand about 90%, usually more, of the text without needing a dictionary. This is possible because I'm familiar with Norwegian, Swedish, and English, and the Dutch language is, for the most part, a mixture of these 3 with some German here and there. If I had been very familiar with German as well, I would have never needed a dictionary. But I'm not, so there's that. The reverse is also possible. For instance, most of the Italian immigrants in Romania get much faster to the state of where they can make themselves understood in the Romanian language than to the state where they can also understand what is being said to them. This makes perfect sense because the grammar, the pronunciation rules, and most of the vocabulary of the Romanian language is very, very, very similar to the Italian grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary. However, the idioms and other common expressions in Romanian are radically different from the ones in Italian, which means they are harder to retain, which results in Italian immigrants needing more time to get those as well. This situation is even more common with immigrants into Greek-speaking areas. The Greek language is essentially a language made up of idioms. Even after you have arrived to a state where you have a full grasp of the vocabulary and grammar, you still won't be able to confidently say, I speak Greek, because common parlance is rife with idioms. So after years of study, you will be able to say, I understand the Greek language to a certain extent. That's it. You'll need another 5 years of study or 2 years of continuous living in Greek-speaking areas until you'll be able to say, I speak Greek. Also, this whole thing depends both on the language being learned and the native language of the student. If your native language is, let's say, Italian, and you start studying Portuguese or Romanian, getting to the point of understanding the studied language without actually being able to speak it is the natural progression of things. However, if your native language is, let's say, Hungarian, and you start studying Japanese, the natural progression will look slightly different. You'll get to the phase of understanding written text much faster than being able to understand spoken word. Also, I've seen some Hungarians getting to the point of being able to make themselves understood faster than to the point of getting what it is spoken to them. Even so, as a general rule, understanding a language usually comes first. Most teachers and most students don't get this, which is why they downgrade their own performances for minor pronunciation mistakes, which over the long run can lead to a significant drop in students' interest in the new language. Don't do that. Fix your understanding first, your grammar and vocabulary second, and your pronunciation last. By the time you have the first two fixed, you'll notice that your pronunciation has already improved by itself, leaving only fine-tuning work to be done. Number 2. It is easier to learn a sixth language than to learn a second language. Well, not always. It does depend which is the sixth language and what are the first 5, but as a general rule, this rings true. It is often said that the marker of intelligence is not necessarily the ability to memorize facts, but the ability to make correlations between them. And this is a skill that is very much needed in this situation. The degree to which you will need this skill varies from language to language. For instance, there are little to no correlations to be made if your native language is Finnish and you're trying to learn Arabic. However, if you speak Turkish, German, English, and Spanish, you'll suddenly notice there are some correlations, albeit small and disparate, to be made when studying Arabic. Now, admittedly, Arabic is a poor example because there isn't just one Arabic, but let's set that aside for the moment. As a rule, every continent has 2 or 3, let's call them big languages. That once you've learned them, then it becomes fairly easy to learn most of the smaller ones. For instance, if you speak Arabic, Swahili, and English, you'll be fine in almost all of Africa. Asia is a bit more diverse, but if you speak Russian, Arabic, Urdu, Hindi, and English in this order, you'll be fine in the overwhelming majority of Asia. Now, the big language status is not necessarily dictated by politics or by the number of native speakers, although those of course do play a role, but it is also dictated by how easy it is to be learned and of course by history. For instance, contrary to what you'll be told, in sadly too many places, English by itself is still rather useless as a language on the vast majority of the planet. You're much better served if you know English, Russian, and Arabic than if you speak German, Portuguese, and Mandarin. And mind you, German, Portuguese, and Mandarin are in and of themselves quite big languages, but because of history, they are less useful than English, Russian, and Arabic. This, of course, leaves room for local variation, which brings me to point number 3. Not all languages are useful. I realize this should be self-evident, but in the current era of cultural relativism and militant egalitarianism, this needs to be reasserted. A person speaking Georgian, Luxembourgish, Afrikaans, Hungarian, and Basque is far less served by his own foreign language skills than a person speaking English, German, Arabic, Russian, and Urdu, even though both speak 5 languages that include at least a Semitic language, at least a European one, and at least an African one. The latter person, in my example, will have a much easier time going along on most of the planet for sure. Now, of course, I gave an extreme example here, but the point still does stand. Unless you're planning to move into or do business with or in a country with an obscure language, you're wasting your time learning it. It should be mentioned, though, that not all obscure languages are useless, and also the degree of uselessness varies. For instance, Hebrew is an obscure language, but it is far more useful than Swedish or Dutch, especially if you're dealing with international commerce. Similarly, Serbian or Serbo-Croatian and Bulgarian are both rather small languages with about 9 million native speakers each. Yet Serbian is far more useful than Bulgarian because it opens up to the entirety of the ex-Yugoslav space, as well as several highly influent immigrant communities in North America, other parts of Eastern Europe, and Sweden. The point I'm trying to make with these examples is that the total number of native speakers is not a good enough indicator of the usefulness of a language, at least not a good indicator in and of itself. As many historians have correctly observed, when it comes to languages, demographics is not always destiny. Languages travel faster than genes. After all, English has only 400 million native speakers and spread on 4 continents. Now that may seem impressive until you realize that Hindi, for instance, has more native speakers and is also spread on 4 continents. Yet English is far more useful. Another example would be Mandarin versus Russian. Mandarin has almost 1 billion native speakers, whereas Russian only has about 180 million native speakers. Yet Russian is far more useful than Mandarin by quite a very far margin. So, to sum up this point, while there are individual circumstances that would suggest to an individual to learn one language over the other, as a general rule, there are a few languages that are almost always useful, and in my experience, these are Russian, English, Arabic, French, and Spanish. The more of these 5 you speak, the better. I speak 3 of them, and I'm quite decent in Spanish. Eventually, I'll get familiar with Arabic too, which brings me to the 4th point. Number 4, speaking a language is usually not a political statement. This is something to chew on for many of the pundits out there. No, the fact that you're fluent in one language over another is not a political statement. For instance, the degree of disdain and outright hatred for Russia that Georgians hold cannot be understated. Yet meeting a Georgian who doesn't at least understand some Russian is quite hard. Why? Because the Russian language is still very useful. Even the young people learn it, even those who've been displaced by the Russian invasion of, let's say, Abkhazia. Similarly, when the United States bombarded Serbia, almost nobody there spoke English. Now, most people speak English, and in the bigger cities, particularly Novi Sad and Belgrade, English is so common that it could very well be the country's 2nd official language, even while most Serbs hold a very high degree of disdain for the United States. This is because English is useful. Not learning a language because of politics is brutally stupid. Trying to shame someone or impute malice on someone's character for being fluent in a language is also stupid. Are we clear? Alright, number 5. Ethnicity, upbringing, and mother tongue matters. This again is something you won't hear too much because it's not kosher. In the current year, we're being told consistently that everyone can do it and it's only a matter of will. Now, it is true that only those who have the will to learn foreign languages end up learning them, but will is not everything, and oftentimes will is nowhere near enough. There are certain characteristics that will stand in one's way. Some of those being immutable characteristics, while some indeed are socially constructed. For instance, you won't hear a Swede speaking impeccable Japanese. Now, I'm sure there are a few Swedes who speak impeccable Japanese, but as a general rule, if Japanese were to become a mandatory language in Swedish schools, most Swedes will never speak it properly. Why? Because the Japanese pronunciation system is so different from the Swedish one that it will rarely be the case that an individual will be able to surmount that problem. Also, there is a case to be made that ethnically Japanese people perceive the sound slightly different than Europeans. There is quite a lot of research to back that up, so as a result, a European learning Japanese has quite a few hurdles in front of him if the goal is to reach native speaker level. Also, some native languages are worse than others, in the sense that people coming from certain languages have a much harder time learning foreign languages than others. One example very close to me is the Hungarian language. Individuals who have Hungarian as their native tongue have a much harder time learning foreign languages than individuals that have Romanian as their native tongue. Put simply, when I used to do the podcasts with Hufnagel Pisto back in 2012 and 2013, he had to work harder than I had to work in order to sustain a conversation in English. And that's not his fault, or mine for that matter. It just simply is the case that if you are brought up speaking only Hungarian, you will have to study much harder in order to acquire the skills in a second or a third language. A prime example and famous example is George Soros, or Soros György. He has been living in England and the United States continuously for 71 years. Yet he still speaks English like a 15-year-old in an average high school in Budapest. And it's not like Soros is stupid or that he didn't try. It just is what it is. Now, can this be solved? Yes. But it requires a lot of work, and the work needs to be fine-tuned almost on a case-by-case basis. Because these are not universal in the sense that not all hurdles are the same. For instance, those having Arabic as their native tongue have to face different challenges than those who have Hungarian or German as their native tongue when they study English. And this is true for all languages. For instance, Arabs trying to learn Norwegian will have a hard time with words like høyre, which is right, as in to the right, or veier, which is roads, partly because diphthongs aren't a thing in Arabic. Similarly, those with Romanian as a native tongue learning Russian will have a hard time with words like približajeția, which is getting closer, or vozvaščajeția, which is turning around or coming back, partly because such brutally consonantic constructions just aren't a thing in Romanian, or any other Latin language for that matter. And notice these are common words, not some weird notion or animal that you don't exactly need in common conversations. Yet those who teach foreign languages are advised to ignore these ethnic-based considerations purely on ideological grounds. We're supposed to pretend that everyone is the same. And that's just simply not true. Alright, I think that's enough for now. I would also mention, though, that one should not be discouraged if one's skills aren't improving at a fast enough pace. Again, not everyone is equal. It took me 7 years to learn English and Russian, yet it took me less than 1 year to learn Norwegian. Just like not all people are equal, not all languages are equal either. And while there are some general guidelines regarding the difficulty of a language, the degree of difficulty varies by individual as well. For instance, the US Foreign Service classifies languages in 5 categories depending on how long it takes for a native English speaker to learn them. In the first category, languages closely related to English, the Foreign Service Institute ranks Swedish, French and Romanian on the same category. As a speaker of all 3 of them and of English, I assure you that's very far away from the truth. Swedish is much easier to learn for a native English speaker than French or Romanian will ever be. So if you're looking for a language to learn and your only criterion is how easy it is, then I'm afraid you'll have to try out several languages before you discover which one is easier for you. Alright, so what do you all think? What languages have you tried to learn? How hard or how easy was or is the process? In a future video, I will explain what one should learn first when approaching a foreign language. Most guides for individuals and most teachers have this approach of starting with the easiest portion of the language, an approach which is, in my opinion, wrong and counterproductive. One could start with the useful portion. But until then, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do subscribe to my social media, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.